Mr Johnson.
Thank you, my lady. Mr Swinney, we had got to the conclusion of the discussion around text messaging and WhatsApp messaging just before the break. If I could pick up, please, with you at paragraph 18, page 8 of your second statement. 979 at the end. Yes. This again is related to informal means of communication, in this instance telephone discussions. You say all of my discussions were focused on taking forward the direction that had been set by Cabinet and addressing practical issues that arose as a consequence. Many of these informal discussions would be by telephone, and if there was any relevant information that was required to be placed on the corporate record, this would be undertaken by me issuing an email to my private office or an official recording the necessary information. So as far as telephone conversations were concerned, a similar process to the one that we discussed earlier. Is that broadly correct? That's
correct, yes.
You go on then to list the individuals you conversed with, including Ms Sturgeon, Ms Freeman and Mr Youssef, and you accept that you discussed matters around the progress of the pandemic in Scotland, commented upon the advice received in relation to the pandemic in Scotland, commented upon the nature of decisions that the Scottish Government might have to take, you made any decisions about the Scottish Government's response to the pandemic, and commented upon the decisions which the Scottish Government had taken. And then you state any decisions taken were consistent with the Cabinet direction and were always recorded in the corporate record. So is it correct to understand that all of the matters that I've listed you accept were part of those telephone discussions?
Yeah, I do, yes, sir.
Thank you. And I'd be interested just to explore with you a little, come back to talking about Cabinet a bit later, but you say there that decisions taken via this means and by others were based on the direction set by Cabinet. Can you give us some indication as to what that actually means in terms of what was the expectation of what would be done at Cabinet and what was the expectation of what would be done in other fora, including these telephone conversations, by way of decision making?
Well, Cabinet was the decision-making forum, so that's where decisions were arrived at, other than where Cabinet took a decision to delegate that to another individual, invariably the First Minister and or myself in certain circumstances. But Cabinet was the decision-making body, and it would set out the direction of travel that we were taking, and that at one moment in the pandemic could be the application of very tight restrictions of the nature that we experienced in the early part of the pandemic, or it might be taking decisions about relaxing some of those restrictions. And what would follow from that and any other subsequent conversations were discussions about how we turn that into operational or practical reality, or any issues that arose as a consequence that we could resolve within the framework or the direction that Cabinet had set.
Because in the context of the pandemic in particular, it may be, you assert, of course, your position is that the Cabinet took the decisions, other than where there was a delegation. But it might not be other people's interpretation as to precisely what happened, in the sense that if the Cabinet said, oh, we see cases are rising, we think that there should be something done about that, that might be deemed to be the direction. But all of the means by which the rising cases were then combated, the various means open to government to be able to do that, if those decisions about those practical aspects are taken elsewhere, really all the decisions are taken out with Cabinet, isn't that right?
I wouldn't accept that, no, because I think the nature of the content of Cabinet minutes will show that I think both of the elements that you raise in your question, Mr Dawson, are happening at Cabinet. Cabinet is saying we are concerned about the rising cases and we need to do something about it, and here are the things that we are going to do about it. And then what might be left to delegation might be what I would describe, and I think I used the word in my statement, marginal questions, which would then be the subject of perhaps further interaction with advisers, and then the minuting of what is the conclusion of that process of delegation.
As far as the matters that I've listed which you accepted were part of these telephone conversations were concerned, is it your position that all of those things, discussions around the progress of the pandemic, comments upon advice, commenting upon the nature of decisions the Scottish Government might take, the Scottish Government did take, and decisions the Scottish Government had taken, Is your position that all of the salient features of those discussions are on the corporate record?
I would say so, yes.
Okay. And of course, as I said earlier, as similarly as regards the WhatsApps, we would be able to check that by checking the corporate record, the paperwork we've been given by the inquiry about the management of the pandemic, with what we can see from others' messages, because your messages generally aren't available through you. Yes.
Yes.
Could I just, as a point of clarification, you rightly pulled me up earlier when I was asking a question about the point at which the First Minister announced there would be likely to be a public inquiry, and you asked about the month. You were absolutely right to do so, because I insisted, frankly, that it was March. I think, in fact, it was May of 2020 when those comments were made, which, of course, would be much more consistent, I think, with the way in which information about the care home situation arose. Is that broadly right?
That was just what confused me in your question.
Because I think it may also be what confused me, because it was March when a lot of the people in the care homes were being infected and ultimately dying. Is that right?
Obviously, there was a period where there was some acute pressure within care homes, and that went on for a very long time. But there was, I suppose, an intense period of pressure, which would be in that March to April period.
So the period where a lot of the infections were occurring, which ultimately led to 50% of the deaths in the first wave in Scotland, occurred March, April. Is that your understanding?
That's correct, yes.
And it was only in May, when the First Minister made the comments to which I referred earlier about the likelihood of a public inquiry, that was coming to light and being discussed openly in the Parliament and in other places.
Yes.
As regards one further aspect to do with your phone, before I move on to other areas, the phone, as I understand it, that you used throughout this period was a personal phone. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you give an explanation in one of your statements to the effect that it was convenient for you to use a personal phone because you had a particular BlackBerry app that you used, and it was easier to use that in conjunction with your personal phone. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Do you broadly, given your vast ministerial experience, think that there may well be other concerns about senior ministers like yourself using personal phones, and that might be something that would be looked at by the Scottish Government in future?
I understand that unease, and the issues for me were practical issues. I could access with one device my Scottish Government email account, which is the one, as I said in the session before lunch, I used habitually. I was on it all the time to submit to emails and respond to emails from my private office. I had that securely on my personal device, and it meant I only had one phone number and one phone to carry about, because the dangers of losing phones are enormous the more you have.
But there may also be dangers associated with using personal phones which are not fully within the control of the Scottish Government.
I understand that, yes.
Thank you. Could I move on then, Mr Swinney, to something that I've touched on already? It's to do with the decision-making processes of which you are, as you've accepted, a fundamental part. I'd like to ask you, first of all, by way of clarification to an extent of some of the evidence that you gave in Module 1, if we could sort of start off where we left off with you there, and then move into the actual decision-making process which happened during the COVID period. You gave some evidence in Module 1, as I understand it, that obviously you had a responsibility for resilience matters prior to the pandemic. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And you gave some evidence to the related, this is the point of clarification, not to the SCORE system, the resilience room system itself, but to a Scottish Government Resilience Cabinet subcommittee,
yes,
which was involved in discussing, preparing the way in which resilience might work. Is that correct?
If I can perhaps provide some detail on this. The Cabinet in the period up until about 2010 had an operational Cabinet subcommittee on resilience, and that met very infrequently, but it was essentially looking at strategic preparations for the for any resilience event, whatever that might be. We have we're more accustomed to winter weather resilience arrangements than to pandemics. We have a lot of them.
That's why SCORE itself did meet, is it not?
Correct. Yes. So, but then what we began to find after 2010 was that SCORE was meeting on a regular basis. The same cast list was largely round the table that would be round the table for the Cabinet Subcommittee. So all business really got transacted in SCORE, which met very frequently over the years after 2010. So the idea that somehow a resilience grouping stopped in 2010 and nothing else happened, that was not the case. The resilience activity was undertaken under the umbrella of SCORE, which tended to have the First Minister, the Deputy First Minister, relevant Cabinet members round the table with senior officials, and that met very frequently in the aftermath of 2010.
But this subcommittee that we're talking about, it had a role in organising, preparing for the way in which resilience would work. There was an operational role for that body as opposed to SCORE itself.
I would say, well, that's probably a fair assessment, but what the SCORE arrangements did was they recognised the fact that we had to have a whole range of different players involved in our resilience activity. So we tended to develop our strategic thinking around the Scottish Resilience Partnership, which I think I put on the record to the Module 1 hearings, drew together figures from local government, from Police Scotland, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, the local authority chief officers and other organisations who were critical to enabling us to have effective resilience arrangements. And from that, initiatives such as the Scottish Risk Assessment emerged, which was a strategic overview of what were the likely potential threats or resilience issues that Scotland may have to face. And that became a focal point for our planning for future events.
Was it the case that the fact that the Scottish Government Resilience Cabinet Subcommittee had not met since 2010, was it the case that that created something of a deficit in the organisational aspects of the way that any resilience response would be, in fact, conducted through SCORE?
I don't think that's the case, because there was engagement at the most senior level in the Scottish Resilience Partnership and also within SCORE about all of these issues on an ongoing basis. And from time to time, these issues would also come to Cabinet as well. So the Scottish Risk Assessment, if my memory serves me right, I am pretty certain went to Cabinet, or the resilience thinking around about that would have gone to Cabinet as well.
Is it the case, as I understand the evidence from Module 1 that you and others gave, that resilience was effectively, in a broad sense, a reserved matter?
I wouldn't say there's, I suppose in a legislative sense, there will be certain legislative instruments which will be wholly reserved. The civil contingencies legislation, for example, will be wholly reserved. But when it comes to responding to the practicalities of resilience arrangements, many of the issues are devolved and wholly devolved.
Well, this is exactly what I wanted to try and clarify with you, Mr. Swinney, because if there were, prior to the pandemic, hypothetically speaking, to be our response to a national emergency, would it be the case that the resilience operations would be delivered on an operational level through the various partnerships in Scotland that you've described, but that if that emergency had been emergency response had been instigated through the Civil Contingencies Act, that the policies connected with how something would be managed at a higher policy level would generally be a matter for the UK government to decide?
I think it would depend on the nature of the circumstances. If, for example, there was any requirement for there to be a response in a resilience arrangement from public services that were devolved to the Scottish Parliament, for ease of reference, health, education, police, fire, transport, local government, the involvement and the engagement of the Scottish Government and the Scottish parliamentary arrangements would be critical, because the constitutional arrangements that we have today make it clear that those are all devolved functions. And in my view, it would be anti-democratic for that not to be the case. I do accept, however, there may be certain steps taken by the United Kingdom government properly under the existing legislative framework approved by the House of Commons and the House of Lords for provision through the Civil Contingencies Act. But if there were practical issues that had to be addressed by the devolved public services in Scotland, that would have to take into account the constitutional arrangements that we have, that, in short, the Scottish Government runs those things.
Yeah, so you would organise the practical arrangements within health or police or fire services, whatever would be needed to be able to respond?
If it was taken forward under the umbrella of the Civil Contingencies Act.
Yes.
But my contention is that that wouldn't be a particularly effective way to do that, because of the fact that there is policy responsibility as well as operational responsibility vested in the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government for the exercise of those functions consistent with the Scotland Act of 1998 and successive legislation.
But as we've discussed with other witnesses, including Mr Gove yesterday, it was a possibility that the pandemic might have been dealt with as a Civil Contingencies Act situation. It might have been.
It might, but I think Mr Gove also said that he didn't think that would be appropriate.
Well, eventually we knew that he and his government did not think it was appropriate, as I understand it. Neither did the Scottish Government.
We did not know.
One other aspect of your M1 evidence, before we move on to the substance of what we're looking at, you were asked about, in your Module 1 evidence, about the state of relationships between the two governments, the Scottish Government and the UK Government, as at the beginning of the pandemic. And you said that generally the relationships between the administrations were pretty poor by that point, poor in the aftermath of Brexit, because obviously constituent parts of the United Kingdom, well, in Scotland, we were not happy with Brexit at all, or not happy with, and you obviously had to spend a lot of time on the no-deal Brexit, as the inquiry heard this morning from Nicola Sturgeon, but generally relations were pretty poor. I just wanted to clarify with you that that remains your understanding of the position, and in particular, I wanted just to clarify with you the generality of the evidence that you've already given, to the extent that you don't limit that, for example, to personal relationships between any individuals, but generally between the governments. You suggest that the relations were pretty poor.
Well, there was. I think it would be fair to say that things were pretty strained after the no-deal Brexit experience, and there was a. I think a strain is the best way to put it. I think, however, and I think one of the other points that I put on the record in my Module 1 evidence was that generally on resilience issues, we all tended to work collaboratively with each other. And my experience of interacting with UK ministers on resilience issues, of which I'd been quite a number of occasions, we generally managed to work on a collaborative basis.
Did that continue to be your experience as regards the extent to which you had to work with any UK government ministers or officials during the course of the pandemic? Because we've heard conflicting evidence about that already.
I think it varied. I think on, for example, as Education Secretary, I had quite a lot of interaction with a reasonable amount of interaction with the UK Secretary of State for Education and my counterparts in Wales and Northern Ireland, and these were always very helpful and collaborative and courteous conversations. And I've set out in other respects areas where we were able to make some headway, other areas where it was a bit more difficult to make some headway.
What were the areas in which there was difficulty?
I think often, I think if I look at the pandemic, I think there was a sense in March 2020 that we would have liked things to be moving faster to move to a response to COVID. And then I think when we got to the moment of lockdown, that was agreed on a collaborative basis. Mm-hmm. I think the relaxation of lockdown was difficult because there were different circumstances in different parts of the United Kingdom, which made it difficult for there to be a one-size-fits-all. It didn't suit everybody to be moving at the same pace because of the condition of the pandemic, and that added to some of that made things a bit tense.
So we've heard, just on that latter point, we've heard some evidence about tensions which seem to be apparent from materials that we've looked at in around the May period of 2020. Would that be coincident with your second category there, when the restrictions were being eased, or are you talking about a different period?
I think it probably would have started around about that time, where there would be a sense that we had to take account of the different circumstances in different parts of the United Kingdom.
That had always, of course, been a possibility, because the legislation enabled Scotland to take a different path if it was thought appropriate.
That's correct, yes.
Could I ask then some questions about the decision-making during the course of the pandemic itself? I've already referred to the Cabinet. In your evidence, you suggest that members of the Cabinet would be invited to express their views on all matters before Cabinet. The First Minister would generally sum up the discussion and an agreed position would be arrived at. While different views and proposals would often be considered, Cabinet never held a vote on any issue in connection with COVID-19 or any other issue for that matter. Can you please explain to us why it was that Cabinet never voted on any matter related to COVID, given your position that Cabinet was the main decision-making body?
Because Cabinet aired its views. We had the evidence in front of us, and the First Minister would get to a summary position, and that would be a summary position that would be informed by the evidence and from what had been expressed at Cabinet. And I suppose, my comment, which you've read out, Mr Dawson, is absolutely correct. In my 16 years in the Cabinet, there wasn't a single vote on any single issue, because that's not how Cabinet did its business. It did its business by trying to come to a point of agreement. And I suppose if a member of Cabinet felt they just could not go along with what had been agreed, then, we all know how the system works. Once Cabinet decides, collective responsibility kicks in, and if you can't live with it, then you have to resign from the Cabinet.
Yes.
And no member chose to do so. So I think all of us in the Cabinet would be entirely cognizant of the working approaches of the Cabinet, and would know what was the course of action to take if we didn't agree with it.
Was it the case that when, I think, Cabinet meetings, other than extraordinary meetings, of which there were some examples, generally took place on a Tuesday? Was that correct?
That's correct, Tuesday morning at 9:30.
And I think there was as we understand it from the paperwork, a certain process by which materials would be put together for the purpose of Cabinet, and it would possibly tend to involve meetings of a smaller group of Cabinet, tending to involve the First Minister and usually, as we understand it, yourself and certain others, to discuss matters which might then be put before Cabinet. Is that broadly correct? That is an interpretation of the materials that we have. Is that
broadly? I would say that is a fair summary. That not in all cases, but certainly at some of the key moments of the handling of the pandemic in relation to the relaxation of restrictions, there might be a discussion that would be convened involving the First Minister, myself, the Health Secretary. There would, at different stages, be either the Finance Minister or the Economy Minister, and latterly those two jobs were combined by Kate Forbes, along with some senior officials and senior advisors. And we would tend to look at evidence presented to us about the state of the pandemic and what were the possible choices that we might have in front of us at that particular moment in time. And that would be invariably informed by a slide presentation of information that would be led by senior officials about what was the current state of the pandemic, and particularly when it came to questions around about relaxing restrictions, whether there was any scope available to us to relax restrictions given the prevalence of the pandemic and given the strategic direction set by Cabinet that we were trying to suppress COVID to an extent that would allow us to have a bit more normality than any of us were experiencing at that time.
Our interpretation of the paperwork, as we understand it, is that these prior meetings resulted in material then being put to Cabinet based on effectively what that group had thought would be the right thing to do. Cabinet looking at those and then often delegating responsibility back to the First Minister or yourself, who are usually members of the initial group. Is that a fair summary of the process? And to what extent would it be a legitimate conclusion from that decisions were made in this other body beforehand, merely ratified by Cabinet, and then ultimately the detail of the decision being made by the same individual members of that body that met before?
I wouldn't accept that characterisation. What would happen is that there would be an early discussion about some of the evidence base and about some of the options that were available. And there would be, on many occasions, lots of uncertainty about what might be provided for. That would invariably take place maybe towards the end of a week or in the early part of the weekend. And then over the weekend, a very detailed Cabinet paper, which I'm certain the inquiry must have access to, would be prepared, which would give all members of Cabinet the evidence base and then draw out of that evidence base what were the possible actions that could be taken. And those issues would be put to Cabinet, which would then, as the inquiry will see from the Cabinet minutes, a very extensive discussion would be had at those Cabinet meetings. And in that Cabinet meeting, I think it would be fair to say we were wrestling with the dilemmas about to what extent could restrictions be relaxed given the state of the pandemic, or the other side of the coin, given the state of the pandemic, what do we need to do to apply greater restrictions? And Cabinet would come to a position on that. And if there was any marginal detail, and I stress the word marginal detail, that needed to be clarified in the aftermath of a Cabinet discussion, and that might be, particularly when it came to the settling of what local authority areas were in what particular levels, that might require some further interrogation of data. It might have to wait for the data of the day to emerge, which might come at about maybe 12 o'clock on a Tuesday. And there would be limited scope delegated to the First Minister or myself to take that final decision.
Thank you. There are good reasons, are there?
Might I also add, Mr Dawson, that position would then also invariably lead to very open public communication about the issues involved as a consequence.
There are good reasons, are there not, why decision-making in Cabinet is part of our system?
There are.
Amongst possibly others, those reasons include the importance of all Cabinet ministers being able to bring the perspective of their particular portfolio to the discussion. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And if it were to be the case, hypothetically, that discussions took place and decisions reached in smaller groups, that would be a matter which wouldn't derive the benefit of being able to draw on the experience, insight and viewpoint of all of the Cabinet members, which represent really the main cross-sections of parts of society.
I think that would be a problem, but that wasn't what happened in the Scottish Government.
Did the system that I think we're agreed on broadly happening, although we're I think not agreeing on precisely where the decisions were taken, the system of a discussion taking place beforehand, a Cabinet meeting taking place and some element of decision-making being delegated, give rise to a system whereby you, the First Minister, and a small group of selected others effectively made the decisions about how the pandemic should be managed in Scotland?
I wouldn't accept that characterisation at all. I think the decisions were taken by the Cabinet, and if there was anything not undertaken by the Cabinet, it was of a marginal detail in relation to any decision-making, with the exception of a couple of instances at the start of the pandemic, which I've narrated in my witness statement for completeness, where decisions were taken with such urgency that they were taken among smaller groups. And I've been open with the inquiry about where that was the case.
Appreciate that, Mr. Swinney. Was it the case that where ministers brought matters up in Cabinet, the First Minister was often, if she disagreed with that point of view, often sought to trump the view with her own view as to how matters should be undertaken?
Not in my experience. The First Minister encouraged an open discussion at Cabinet, and different points of view were expressed, because these are not perfect or ideal choices. We talked earlier today about the Four Harms framework. I think that was a very helpful framework for us to structure our decision making.
We will return to that.
We will, but all that did was assemble the dilemma. It assembled the dilemmas in front of us. It didn't give us a perfect pathway. It assembled the dilemmas, and we had to try to take the decisions that would allow us to navigate through those challenges.
Might one say that the Four Harms framework pointed out the problem but didn't help with the solution?
I think it pointed out the problem and it helped with the solution.
Okay. Could I look please at INQ 000334792? This is an exchange which took place in messages which are frequent between the now First Minister and Professor Leach, whom you will know, obviously. This is on the 14th of December 2021, 14:07, in amongst a discussion about what had happened at that time in a Cabinet meeting. The context of this, Mr. Swinney, as we looked at with Ms Forbes earlier, is the emerging threat of Omicron. You'll remember in December 2021 that although Scotland had already lived with a period of high cases as a result of the Delta variant, that the Omicron threat was creating an even more pressing situation. And the context is discussions amongst the then Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care and the National Clinical Director about what should be done about that. Mr. Youssef said, "I took a hell of a bullet at Cabinet, ! But might be able to strengthen the measures, even if it's just slightly. We think we can find £100 million within the portfolio. Not sure if that's enough, but I've pushed to ask if it's enough to move limits on gatherings in households and hospitality into regs for at least the next 4 weeks." He then says, "Don't know if it'll happen this last minute, and FM not remotely happy it's at this last stage, but let's see if it strengthens a package of measures that are far too weak as things stand." To which Professor Leach responds, "I was listening. I almost intervened to deflect for you. She was ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous." And he replies, "And yes to the principle." And Mr. Youssef said he didn't realise he was on the call. That's just the way it is. Her ranting at me isn't the problem. I can take it. It's whether the quantum at this stage helps us strengthen the package. Though feel free to defend me at a later stage. Today's numbers lower than expected. Suspect some people are not testing given Christmas round the corner. Do these messages not show the culture of the Scottish Cabinet was driven by Nicola Sturgeon's strong-mindedness, when challenging her was seen as taking a bullet?
No, because I think that particular morning, if I remember it correctly, I think the First Minister was just a little bit surprised that the health portfolio had been able to find £100 million to transfer to, I think, to business support, which in all my 10 years of handling the public finances of Scotland, the Health Secretary never offered me £100 million in return for anything. I think it probably surprised the First Minister. So that would be not my sense about how business was transacted. Cabinet had open and full discussions. And again, I'm sorry, I suspect I might exhaust your patience today, Mr. Dawson, on the Four Harms framework. But we would constantly be wrestling with the dilemmas that would be involved in establishing a path out of the situation that we found ourselves in, because there was no easy answer.
Do these messages show that whilst Cabinet Secretaries might complain in private, as in the exchange we've looked at, they would ultimately fall back in line behind the First Minister, who is really calling the shots?
Well, if I come back to the answer I gave earlier on, if a member of the Cabinet can't live with a Cabinet decision, then we all know what the rules are. You resign from the Cabinet.
Would it be accurate to say that given the volume and complexity of information that was available to take into account in decision making, that sharing that burden of responsibility amongst Cabinet members, rather than expecting it to be assimilated and borne by one or two people, would be a sensible way to govern?
That's why we had extensive Cabinet papers. In total, 71 papers were put to Cabinet with comprehensive evidence, background and recommendations, 61 of them authored by me, to enable Cabinet to come to have those very discussions about the dilemmas, because it was accepted that these were difficult dilemmas and they had to be, and we had to establish a way through them.
And we should be able to see the nature and extent of those discussions in Cabinet from the Cabinet minutes?
I would have said so, yes.
We are not, however, able to see the extent of the discussions that took place in other important bodies, such as the group that I mentioned, referred to at times as the Gold Group or Gold Command, and indeed the Score Group, for which there are no minutes.
I think on the Gold meetings, my view would be that in a large amount of my experience, well, the format of the Gold discussion was that essentially a slide deck would be gone through. In these meetings all took place, well, invariably took place on Teams. So a slide deck would be presented to us all remotely, and we would interact with that and discuss and debate the different issues that were in front of us. And then in the aftermath of that, there would be a summary note would be prepared, which would be invariably, in my recollection, a minute from Ken Thompson, the Director General, who the inquiry heard from a couple of weeks ago, which would then be issued to those who participated. And I think we actually would have had wider circulation than that, because more people needed to hear the contents of those discussions. So that would be the process of recording the Gold discussions. Now, I think I would accept that I certainly felt I saw all that traffic, all those follow-up notes for a substantial period of the pandemic. I'm not sure I saw it for the whole of the pandemic, so I would accept that there may be times where there isn't all of that information that's there, but there should be, and I accept that point. And then when it comes to SCORE, SCORE tends to be a place where operational decisions are taken and then a list of actions identified as to what is to be taken forward, and that would be the approach that would be taken.
But again, there are no minutes of the discussion that took place. So whether one can see the outcomes from documents that may or may not be available from certain periods, one doesn't know what the nature of the discussion was, and therefore the basis upon which any operational decisions or other decisions then presented to Cabinet were made.
Well, I think if you take the Gold discussions, what I've said there is that the process of, there will be a presentation of evidence, which I'm certain will be available. There will be a summary note of the points that arose and were concluded as a consequence. And then that would essentially be the drafting blocks of the Cabinet paper that would then go to Cabinet. So the inquiry would be able to see, I would think, through all of that, a clear line of sight of the thinking that was going in to the conclusions that were being arrived at. And ultimately in the Cabinet paper, a relationship between the evidence that was being gathered, the conclusions drawn, and the actions that were being proposed as a consequence.
Why were these meetings not minuted?
Well, I've explained the basis on which I think they were being recorded, so that there was essentially the Gold meetings were preparing material that would go to Cabinet, and the inquiry will see those Cabinet papers and the Cabinet minutes that arise out of them. And I certainly can recall various notes which summarised the discussions that took place within the Gold meetings, which again flowed into the drafting of the Cabinet papers as a consequence.
In the same way as in the emails to your private office, you summarised matters that you wish to put on the corporate record?
Yes.
Could I ask you some questions about something I think you referred to earlier, some of the early decision-making, very early in March 2020, and the delegation of decision-making in that regard? There was a decision taken, as I understand it, to recommend a ban on mass gatherings on the 12th of March 2020. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And that decision was made out with Cabinet. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
I understand that the decision to cancel mass gatherings of more than 500 people was taken by the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport and the First Minister, with input from the Chief Medical Officer on the morning of the 12th of March 2020. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
A Cabinet meeting took place on the 10th of March 2020, which is INQ 000238706. Looking at page 3, paragraph 10. You're listed as attending that meeting. It says, paragraph 7 of the paper made clear that while current scientific evidence did not suggest that closing schools or cancelling large-scale events would have a significant effect, this should be kept under review. In addition, even though the epidemiological evidence might not yet imply the cancellation of large-scale events, other factors might apply, notably behavioural ones. There might, for example, be a problem with the credibility of a public message advising significant restrictions of personal behaviour while allowing a business-as-usual approach for large events. So the Cabinet on the 10th of March discusses the cancellation of mass gatherings and I think decides to keep it under review as there is not the scientific evidence to support the ban. Is that the position as at that stage?
That's correct, yes.
2 days later, Nicola Sturgeon and others have made that decision. Is this not an example of a decision that ought to have been made in Cabinet?
I'm in a difficult position to answer questions in detail about this particular moment because on the 11th of March I was called away from Parliament because my mother's health had deteriorated and unfortunately she died on the morning of the 12th of March, so I was not in close proximity to the decision making that was been taken on the 12th of March. So
my condolences in that regard, Mr. Swinney. However, I'm simply asking whether this is a decision that ought to have been taken in Cabinet, which doesn't really require any actual involvement.
I don't think a decision of that nature, given the pace of events at that time, would necessarily need to be made in the Cabinet, because the Cabinet minute says, paragraph 7 of the paper made clear that while current scientific advice did not suggest that closing schools or cancelling large events would have a significant effect, this should be kept under review. So the Cabinet has essentially opened up that question, and I suspect we may come on to the issues in relation to the sequencing of decisions about school closures, because the wording is not dissimilar in relation to that question. And I think so there was scope being left for that issue to be looked at further. And I think, as I understand it, and as I've looked at the explanation given for the announcement of the cancellation of large-scale events, the conclusion that was arrived at was about the risk of pressure on the emergency services at that particular time. And as a consequence, it was judged that that was the right step to take.
If I can move on to the way in which decisions were delegated at other times, the Scottish Cabinet began regularly to delegate decision-making to you and or the First Minister, isn't that right?
As I said earlier on marginal questions and finalising the detail of changes to be made.
Could we look at INQ 000232744, please? Page 7. These are minutes of a Cabinet meeting held on the 19th of December 2020. Paragraph 24, Cabinet agrees to delegate to the First Minister the responsibility for finalising proposals in response to the threat posed by the new variant of the virus. That was the Alpha variant at that time, of course. And all decisions that might be required in advance of her planned public statement later that afternoon. Delegated to the First Minister and Mr Swinney the responsibility for any further decisions that might be required to take into account any material changes in circumstances of which they might become aware. This is, in effect, a delegation of all decision-making power at that stage, isn't it?
No, what I would say is that in all of that is consistent within the strategic framework that Cabinet has considered, which is referred to in paragraph C, and Cabinet has also had a full discussion about the circumstances and the issues that we are confronting. And when, so that particular moment is taking, the Cabinet has had its discussion, it is establishing what are the challenges and the difficulties that we face, is airing the type of changes that we have got to encounter, because the Cabinet paper will have narrated those particular choices, and then is essentially within that framework saying to the First Minister and to I to finalise any of those particular points before public communication.
This is in effect the Cabinet saying, at this very important time as the Alpha variant is starting to become part of the picture, shortly before ultimately the second lockdown in Scotland, we agree that you need to do something about it. It's up to you and Ms Sturgeon to work out what.
I think the, can I just be reminded of the date of that Cabinet meeting?
The 19th of December
2020.
Of 2020, that's right.
Yeah, because what there then proceeds to be further dialogue after that, which results in a Cabinet meeting, if my memory serves me right, on Monday the 4th of January 2021, that takes explicit decisions about the handling of the arrangements thereafter, which resulted in the second lockdown. So the second lockdown arrangements are not agreed by the Cabinet on the 19th of December. They are agreed by the Cabinet on the 4th of January 2021.
There was a Gold Command meeting in advance of that on the 2nd of January.
That's correct, yes.
That was not attended by Ms Forbes, we learned earlier, is that right? Do you recall?
I can't recall.
There's a, I could go to INQ 000232688. This is the 4th of January, a paper presented to Cabinet on the 4th of January by you, as I understand it, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Paragraph 5 on page 1 says, in light of further data on case numbers across Scotland over the past week and further emerging evidence on the new strain, Ministers met chief clinical advisors and lead policy officials in Gold Command format on the 2nd of January. At that meeting, the First Minister concluded that urgent further action would be required to curb and reverse the strong growth in transmission, that proposals would be put to Cabinet for collective discussion and decision-making on the 4th of January, and that the presiding officer should be asked to recall Parliament to consider them that day. And at paragraph 20C, if we could go to that, please. Sorry, Mr. Swinney. Over the page, I think, maybe. The outcome of, there's a discussion in this paper where effectively there is a recommendation put to Cabinet as a result of the Gold meeting to strengthen to protection level 4. And as I recall, the outcome of this is that final decisions were delegated to the First Minister for announcement to the Parliament on that day. Is that right?
I think I would. I can't see that from the document.
Yes, that's my understanding of the conclusion of this.
But I think what the Cabinet would have had in front of it proposals for the application of further restrictions.
Yes.
And the Cabinet would have considered those, and if the Cabinet had any issue or concern about the contents of those proposals, Cabinet would have concluded to that effect. But if Cabinet, Cabinet is, well, I think the crucial...
Sorry, there it is, Mr Swin.
Yeah,
sorry.
The first part of it, paragraph A, consider the recommendations for emergency action. So Cabinet has obviously had that in front of it. Note the proposed timing for discussion of the wider review of the strategic framework, and to delegate final decisions to the First Minister for announcement to Parliament on the 4th of January, having heard Cabinet's consideration of the recommendations for emergency action.
So there's detailed discussion 2 days before this, where evidence is presented and a recommendation drawn up. Is that right?
Well, if I could possibly go through the sequence of events, because I think it might help the inquiry in understanding how we found ourselves at this position. On the 19th of December, the previous Cabinet minutes, which took place on a Saturday, the Cabinet was being briefed and was taking decisions about the, as I recall it at that moment, delaying the return of schools after the school holiday, the Christmas holiday. Mm-hmm. The Cabinet then met the following week, which should be on its normal Tuesday meeting. And then Parliament rose for the Christmas recess, but returned just before New Year, I think on the 30th of December, to consider issues in relation to Brexit. And then on, I think, the Saturday thereafter, possibly, either the Friday or the Saturday, we were asked to participate in a gold meeting because of an acute deterioration in the condition of the pandemic, which was causing our chief advisors and our clinical advisors acute concern about the sustainability of the National Health Service. So in the space of a relatively short space in time, the condition of the pandemic deteriorated, and it was judged necessary for us to take the emergency action that was required, and hence the calling of that Cabinet meeting on the morning of the 4th of January and the recall of Parliament that afternoon.
To return to my question, if I may, the position is that there's a detailed consideration in advance of this of materials relevant to the decision that needs to be made at this stage in a couple of days before. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. And then the recommendation is put to Cabinet, and at the end of the day, the final decision is delegated to the First Minister.
Well,
my question, if I could, is does this not demonstrate that, in fact, the Scottish Cabinet was merely a decision ratifying body and not a decision taking body?
No, because I think there's one example being identified here where particular decisions were being delegated to the First Minister, but the First Minister was making that announcement having heard the details of the Cabinet discussion and conversation about it. Now, to look at this a slightly different way, if there was a member of the Cabinet who believed that fundamentally these decisions were unwarranted, then that would appear in the Cabinet minutes. That would be there for us all to see, because the member of the Cabinet would have made it clear that what was being proposed in the recommendations for action were just not on if they thought that to be the case. That's what a minute would capture, and there'll be Cabinet minutes for that occasion. But what and therefore the individual concerned would know what to do in those circumstances. But none of that pertains here, because the Cabinet the Cabinet heard that evidence and accepted that we were in a position where we needed to take emergency action, and the finalisation of that was left to the First Minister.
We looked last week with the now First Minister at an exchange between him and Professor Leach in May 2021, in which, shortly after his appointment as the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care, Mr Youssef was discussing with Professor Leach a number of matters pertaining to rises in cases, in particular in the Glasgow area. There was a deep dive meeting that was due to take place shortly thereafter. Mr Youssef said, OK, I'll be on the deep dive. to which Professor Leach responded, "Good. There was some FM keep it small shenanigans as always. She actually wants none of us." Is this, in a private conversation that Professor Leach probably never thought would come to light, an indication of the actual decision-making process in which the First Minister, the then First Minister, effectively expected to take the decisions herself?
No, because, well, if that had been the case, then I would have had an awful lot more time on my hands than I had during the course of the pandemic. Because Professor Leach, Gregor Smith, Mr Yousaf, Ms Freeman, Ms Forbes, Ms Hislop were frequently on, and many others, frequently on very long calls wrestling with these questions. So the idea of there being a small cast list about who's discussing these points is not one that I would accept.
We've seen exchanges between the then First Minister and Ms Lloyd connected with decision-making around, for example, the number of people who might be allowed to attend weddings and funerals, which appear to demonstrate that the decision is taken in a conversation without apparent explanation of the scientific basis between the two of them. Was that a regular occurrence?
I don't think it would be, no. I think that probably would be one of these details that would be, it wouldn't surprise me if that was a detail that had not been included in the long list of specific commitments that would be made based on scientific advice and had arisen and had to be resolved. But if you look at the Cabinet Papers, the Cabinet Papers contain extensive, very specific details about what should be permitted when. Now, I think there's I would accept that in some of those cases, it might be that there was probably, well, potentially too much specificity about how many people here, there, or whatever the circumstances happen to be. But we were also being asked countless detailed, specific questions because people generally wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to know what was the right thing to do. And we therefore felt obliged to give as much clarity as we possibly could. But all of these conversations would take place within the context of a knowledge of how the pandemic was progressing and whether we had any scope to relax or a necessity to apply restrictions to deal with that situation.
I suspect those who at that time wished to attend the weddings or funerals of their loved ones wouldn't consider the number of people that the Scottish Government prescribed we allowed to attend as a detail. Do you agree?
I think these are unfortunately necessary details which the Scottish Government had to wrestle with. These are, from in the period between the death of my mother and her funeral, we had to completely and utterly change the arrangements for her funeral to the extent that then only 7 of us attended my mother's funeral because things changed in front of us in March 2020. So I accept the agony that causes for people. I unreservedly accept the agony that causes for people. But unfortunately, in the circumstances we found ourselves in, we had to make some of those very specific decisions. And in some cases, we would have got that right. In other cases, we would not got that right. And I'm sorry if we caused any offence to anybody by the way in which we went about that. But the government was being asked for specific provisions, and we felt the need to offer those.
And those who found themselves, like you, in that tragic situation would want to and would be entitled to know how the decision was reached as to how many people were allowed to attend. Would you accept that?
I would, yes.
Thank you. As I have trailed already, we're turning now to the 4 harms framework, which I think you are able to provide considerable assistance on, Mr Swinney. We have already looked in a number of other evidence sessions at the 4 harms framework, at least to understand its broad context, its timing, its intentions, and other witnesses have given us a good deal of evidence as to that. So I don't want to rehearse all of that, but of course I very much want to hear your perspective on the framework and where you saw it fitting in. Our understanding broadly, to remind the audience, is that in April 2020 that the Scottish Government developed this 4 harms framework in order to try to identify 4 separate harms which were caused either by the virus itself or by the countermeasures which had been taken to combat the virus, in order to assist in the future process of weighing up the competing harms in these different 4 areas. Is that broadly correct?
That's correct. I think the only point I would add is that the decision-making that led to lockdown on the 23rd of March 2020 was exclusively taken on the basis of the direct health harm that would arise out of Covid-19 and the necessity of protecting population health. And I 100% support that, and I think that was absolutely the right decision to take. But we recognised that there was a complexity about how we navigated our way back from that, whilst also recognising some of the issues that you've just put to Mr Dawson about the fact that there were multiple harms that arose out of the correct decision, in my view, to lock down on the 23rd of March, but which gave rise to wider complications and implications in the later stages of the in the weeks after the pandemic started.
Thank you. So as I understand it, what you're saying is that the decision to lock down on the 23rd of March was to use the subsequent language from the 4 harms was taken solely on harm 1 related grounds.
Correct.
But in April, there was a realisation that there were being caused and would subsequently be caused other harms which were perhaps more indirectly caused by the virus, including those other harms being non-COVID health-related harms, social harms, and economic harms.
I think the only thing I would add to that is that I think in the period running up to the decision around lockdown, there was also an understanding at that time, pre-23rd of March, that whilst harm 1 may be the decision-making issue about lockdown, we were aware at that time of other harms that were likely to arise. So, as Education Secretary, I was aware from advice and evidence that I saw prior to lockdown of the damage that would be done as a consequence of school closures, but I was aware of that at the time.
Were you aware, obviously in broad terms, it wouldn't take a lot of advice to assist you with reaching the conclusion that closing schools would be bad for children's development and education?
Well, it was part of the advice from SAGE that I had on the 17th of March.
But I was just interested in finding out whether that was in any way assessed or quantified at that stage.
That's essentially the point I'm making, that it was not.
Yes,
because the overwhelming unanswerable case was to address harm 1, whereas what the 4 harms framework was an attempt to do was to give us a basis of reconciling some of those other harms with the acute health harm of COVID.
As far as the position in March was concerned, obviously what you're trying to tell me, I think, is that there was an awareness that these other harms would be caused, but that there wasn't the opportunity to undertake assessments, and that the strategy that was introduced in April was in order to try to assess the extent of these harms more. Is that broad? That's
a fair representation of my position, yes.
It would be fair to say, would it not, that there would be, in particular, certain vulnerable sectors of society that would sustain harm as a result of the virus, but also would sustain harm as a result of the other harms that are caused by the countermeasures. Is that right?
Yes.
To what extent was an assessment of harm done, for example, the likely harm to elderly people or disabled people as regards the virus itself, putting aside for one moment the effects of the countermeasures at the time of the lockdown in March 2020?
That was essentially the core of the modelling and information and data that was presented to us prior to lockdown.
So you had modelling as regards an assessment of the likely harm of the virus on the disabled community?
Yes.
You had modelling on the likely harm of the virus on ethnic minorities?
I think it might be better if I say
that's a yes or no.
I don't know if we had information as specific as that. That's the point I'm just about to arrive at. What I think is a better way for me to express it for the inquiry is that we had data which showed the damaging effect of COVID on those with vulnerabilities. What I cannot be specific about is just how granular that detail was at that particular time.
But the position as regards the other harms, although you're aware that there would be other harms caused, there was no assessment done for any of those groups, or in fact anyone, of the likely impact of those other harms?
That's correct.
Thanks. As regards the framework itself, one of the things that you tell us in your statement is that ministers establish clear frameworks within which to consider the evidence, for example, the strategic framework and the four harms framework. These were rational, evidence-based and published frameworks that enabled ministers to rationalise competing advice and establish clear direction of activity. So as regards the four harms framework, can you explain to us what you mean when you say that the four harms framework enabled ministers to rationalise competing advice and establish clear direction of activity, rather than simply pointing out what the evidence was in each of the areas?
Well, I think two things were done in that respect. One was that a complete evidence picture was assembled to show what were the various harms that were being experienced within society. So there would be, in the immediate aftermath of COVID, the pandemic starting, there were very clear, there's very clear availability of information about the effect that COVID was having on individuals and on society, and that was able to be, we could interact with that information to judge the course of the pandemic.
Just to be clear, so one point about timing, that was from April, was it? From April?
No, I'm talking really about the information on cases and infection rates, cases per 100,000, fatalities. All that information was available from within March.
Yes. But as regards the harms that were being caused to society in general, or particular elements of society falling within harms 2, 3 and 4, when did that information become available?
That would begin to be assembled in the four harms framework in the aftermath of the 23rd of April 2020, when the framework was launched.
What I was interested in is the extent to which you feel able to assert that the framework enabled ministers to rationalise competing advice and evidence to establish a clear direction of activity. It seems that this is a laudable attempt to try to assemble information about that, which may have taken some time to become available. But how does it enable ministers to rationalise all of that information and to make better decisions as to how to manage the pandemic?
Because what it allows ministers to do is to look at the state of the pandemic, which is the intense data sets about the number of cases per 100,000, fatalities, the R number, the progression of the pandemic in different parts of the country, and to establish within the strategic intent of the government to suppress the virus to an extent where it does not provide a threat to public health and to enables individuals to live their lives closer to normality than had been the case. Can then, given that we could never allow the pandemic to run rampant, we had to try to suppress it, but there was a fine judgment to be made about the degree to which we could relax other measures to enable people to live life more normally and to address some of the other harms in COVID, that if we did that, we would essentially be opening up the opportunities for the virus to thrive. And that's really what I mean when I use the word rationalise, that we can actually construct a basis of decision-making that says, given the state of the pandemic, let's for argument's sake say it is receding, we can afford to take some decisions on the other harms that will allow people to live life a bit more normally, to address some of those harms without the risk of inflaming the course of the pandemic.
Thank you. In his expert assessment, Professor Paul Kearney suggested that the four harms strategy was mostly a statement of the problem rather than a statement of the solution. Do you agree?
No.
Why?
Because the framework enabled us to gather evidence of the impacts of the various harms on society, and then to begin to consider how particular measures of relaxation, if we had the headroom to do that, could make a difference in addressing those harms. So it would provide us with a framework that enabled us to take a considered set of judgments based on the very clearly articulated priorities of the government about where we would want to act first to try to reduce harm that was being felt within society.
A four harms group was put together, which I know you were intimately involved with. It started to meet in October 2020, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Why was it that there was a delay between the creation of the framework and the group starting to do its important work?
I think to all intents and purposes, a lot of that work was going on in the period between April and October, although I think it was formalised into the Four Harms group in October. But the Cabinet papers that we saw between April, late April when the framework was established, would have led to decision-making that was consistent with the Four Harms framework, particularly in relation to questions such as the return of school education or whatever the other decisions were in the interim period. So the advisors were gathering together, putting that material together, but it established a formal structure in October.
Would the following be a fair characterisation of what happened over this period? There was a realisation in April that other harms were being caused and there required to be a framework as to how to assemble information about the extent of those harms.
Yes.
In the period thereafter, the policy of the UK government was to prioritise harm one in furtherance of a zero COVID policy.
You said UK.
Sorry, Scotland. In furtherance of a zero COVID policy.
I think that's probably a fair assessment, yes.
By the time the operative mechanism to try to implement addressing the other harms had been put in place in October in the form of the Four Harms group, the virus had returned such that harm one required to be prioritised again.
Well, that misses out what happened between April 2020 and autumn 2020. And crucially, in that period, from my policy perspective, schools had returned in August. So for me, a really, really big harm was being addressed by the return of full-time education for children and young people in Scotland. So so what happened after April was that the prevalence of the virus declined towards the summer. Indeed, when in the period between the formulation of our plan for the return of schooling in the early part of in the middle of 2020, the number of people who were able to transmit the infection were estimated to be about 20,000. By June, that number had fallen by 90% to 2,000. So we'd seen a dramatic fall in prevalence over the summer, which enabled us to do, in my view, one of the most important things we did, which was to reopen schools and to reopen them early on the 11th of August. And But we then experienced increases in the prevalence of the virus in subsequent weeks, for which we took measures in applying restrictions, starting principally in the west of Scotland in September 2020, which were designed to arrest that. And that essentially makes my point that we were, yes, we had harm one. We knew what that looked like. It was a devastating virus that we had to suppress. But we had to try to enable people to live lives slightly more normally than they were without inflaming the path of the virus. And that was the sensitive balance we were trying to construct. And crucially, the decision to return schools in August may well have contributed to that rise in the virus. I have to accept that point. But it did so in a fashion that allowed us to take other steps to tackle harm one.
Thank you. If that's a convenient moment, my lady.
Yes, certainly. I shall return at 15:15.
Thank you.
Mr Dawson.
Thank you, my lady. We were speaking, Mr Swinney, about the four harms framework. You told us helpfully that although there was an awareness in March 2020 that harms would be caused by the restrictions, that no assessments were done at that time, and that the four harms framework was an attempt to start to address those other harms. Was it apparent that there would be harm done, greater, disproportionate harm, to people who suffered inequalities or were in protected groups?
There would be an anxiety that that would be the case. And one of the duties of the Scottish Government in all of our actions is that we must act consistent with the legislative framework in which we operate, one element of which is the Equalities Act 2010, as well as the provisions of the Human Rights Act 1998. So these factors, or these considerations, are absolutely fundamental to decision-making that the Scottish Government has got to undertake. So they would be underpinned in the four harms framework. But I think it's also important to say that as the events of the pandemic were taking their course, we were taking action to try to maximise the support as far as we could within the restrictions to support individuals who faced particular vulnerabilities. So, for example, the steps in relation to supporting the population who were shielding was one aspect of that. There would also be, in relation to my own portfolio, measures in place to ensure that local authorities were properly supporting children who were on the Child Protection Register, to make sure that given the change to services and arrangements, that we could ensure that people were properly supported in that context. And there was other support which we navigated with our local authority partners around food support for people with vulnerabilities and other such provisions.
The reason I asked Mr Swinney about that particular element is because not only is it an important part of the scope of the module, but a number of groups who have an interest in the module, including core participants, have raised with us the question to ask you why it was that inequality wasn't specifically listed amongst the four harms, perhaps as a fifth harm, which I understand may have been the position in a similar framework in Wales. Yeah,
I understand that point, and the reassurance that I would give is that the legislative obligations of the Scottish Government to act consistent with the provisions of the Equalities Act, and therefore the other obligations that we carry in relation to exercising our responsibilities in that respect, were essentially underpinning the decision-making being made in the four harms framework. But if there is a concern that we did not take adequate steps to ensure that was the case, or that by the fact that we didn't have a fifth harm, but that we underpinned equalities considerations in our framework, if that led to a perception amongst groups that we did not give adequate consideration to their interests, then I would apologise for that.
Thank you. But you accept, I think, that there was an obligation, both legal and one might say moral, on the government to take account of the particular harms, the greater harms, I think, has been demonstrated subsequent to the pandemic by vulnerable groups, in particular groups with protected characteristics.
I accept that point, yes.
We've heard a lot of evidence from these groups, some in person and some in written form, that throughout the pandemic, groups which fall within that categorisation feel that the government took inadequate steps to take account of that extra harm. In the opening video that we played at the beginning of the module, one gentleman who came from a background of having mental health difficulties, but I think his statement is broader, said that the Scottish Government, when we started to emerge from lockdown, didn't look around to see whom we had left behind. Why is it, if the Four Harms framework had running through its core these legal and moral obligations, more was not done to address the concerns of these groups, whose interests one could have predicted would be more acute than the general society?
Firstly, I'm sorry if any individual feels in that way, and I obviously am familiar with the material that you put to me, Mr Dawson, and I respect individuals for what they've said. I greatly admire them for that. So I'm sorry if our actions left people feeling in that way. What the government was trying to do was to return society to as much normality as we could whilst continuing to suppress the virus. And I obviously took the best decisions I could at the time and was involved in taking the best decisions that I could. I'm not going to sit here and say that we didn't get all of those decisions correct in trying to exercise that judgment.
When you say you're sorry that your actions left people feeling that way, do you mean that you're sorry that that was the experience, that is what happened to people?
Of course, yes. That's exactly the point I'm making, yes.
Thank you. In his assessment, which I've referred to already, our political expert in this module, Professor Kearney, said in his report that while the Four Harms framework was useful to help plan the release of lockdown measures, there was still high uncertainty about the policy problem, i.e. the likely spread and impact of Covid-19 and likely impact of policy instruments to address Covid-19, which justified a role for the application of judgment in decision-making, taking all factors into consideration, including those that were difficult to quantify with much accuracy or confidence. This uncertainty also provided justification for adopting a cautious approach, particularly at stages during the pandemic when the risk to public health was potentially extreme. For example, the Four Harms approach was not a strong feature, in his view, of the emergency decision-making associated with lockdowns either in March 2020 or January 2021, and routine assessments of the impact of non-pharmaceutical interventions often involve too much uncertainty to make a proper Four Harms assessment. The conclusion that Professor Kearney reached was that the Four Harms assessment, based on the materials which had been produced to him by the Scottish Government in its response to this module, had not formed a part of the decision-making around having the second lockdown, and therefore that the Scottish Government had not learned the lessons from its inability to make those assessments with regard to the first lockdown. I'd be interested in your views on that.
I don't really share that view because, as I narrated in the session just before the break there, I was talking about the situation that we faced in the Cabinet on the 4th of January, which took the decision to move into the second lockdown. I found that I did find that a terrifying couple of days between the briefing that I got about the likely course of the pandemic, which is back to harm one, to put it into the language we've used all of this afternoon. The Harm 1 evidence was absolutely terrifying about what was coming our way in the course of January 2021. And in a sense, the circumstances were very similar, if not identical, to the situation that we'd faced in March 2020, where whichever way you looked at the evidence, it was just impossible to see any way through it other than having to take significant intervention to arrest the pace of the pandemic, because it would then go on to create even more significant harm than we'd experienced before. So in that period, I understand the point that Professor Kearney is making, but the Four Harms framework acknowledged and accepted that there was one very direct acute harm which is caused by the virus, and the rest of the framework is about trying to help us to navigate our way out of the difficulties caused by that set of circumstances if we've managed to get the acute threat of the pandemic under control. And at that moment, on the 4th of January, we were not in that position.
Is it correct to say, given the circumstances, the very pressing circumstances at that time, that the decision that was made was based solely on considerations of trying to suppress the virus and took no consideration or assessment of the other harms that would be done and were known would be done by a further lockdown?
I think that is a way of looking at it, but I think there's also another way of looking at it, which is to say that we faced an acute and serious situation which we had to address, or there would have been even greater harm caused in direct COVID implications.
So was the answer to Mr Dawson's question yes?
I
That's
wasn't.
way of looking at it is.
I wasn't keen on choosing Mr Dawson's words, milady. But I suppose the answer is yes to that question. That we took a decision which was based on the direct health harm. That's what we, because of the extremity of the position we faced on the 4th of January.
Thank you. Ultimately, when decisions are made relating to the way in which the harm should be balanced, those were decisions that were made by politicians, including yourself. Isn't that right?
That's correct, yes.
So the Four Harms gives you the ability to see where harms may be occurring or may occur based on different decisions. But the decision, the balancing, as you put it, requires to be a political decision at the end of the day.
Yes.
We've heard evidence, both again in written form and in oral evidence, in particular from Professor Smith, that decisions about restrictions were often taken based, in part at least, on some perception amongst decision makers of the tolerance of the Scottish people. Was that a concept which featured in your decision making around restrictions?
I wouldn't say that I was particularly influenced by that. I felt that people were prepared, people realised the seriousness of the situation we faced and had shown remarkable willingness to play their part in trying to arrest this very difficult situation that we faced. And I felt if people were given, I understood the frustration. I heard it from people that I have the privilege to represent about how frustrated they were by lockdown and by other issues. So I understand the frustrations, but I can't say I was influenced by about that sentiment.
It would be difficult, would it not, if one were to factor into decision-making a concept as nebulous as the tolerance of the Scottish people, to understand how accurate that assessment could ever be, and indeed what weight to place on it?
Because it will vary from one individual to another, and therefore trying to get some... But my general sense was that people had really played their part in trying to arrest the difficult situation we were in. And we just had to be open with them about what were the nature of the challenges, the severity of the situation that we found ourselves facing.
When he gave evidence to the inquiry, epidemiologist Professor Mark Woolhouse was asked about the four harms framework and indeed its implementation and decision-making. His position as regards the framework itself was that he thought to a large extent the four harms policy, he said, when the four harms policy were mentioned, I was greatly encouraged. So that the announcement of the concept in April was something that really encouraged him. But then he went on to say, as regards the question as to whether he felt it made a difference, it improved decision-making, in particular with regard to taking account of the other harms that would be done by lockdowns or other restrictions. He said, I was thinking it was rhetoric. It was rhetoric. The emphasis was overwhelmingly on harm one, even when, particularly during summer 2020, the public health benefits of continuing to suppress the virus were extremely small. Do you have any comment on the suggestion that the four harms framework, in particular its implementation, was mere rhetoric?
I don't agree with that. I think if I address the point that Professor Woolhouse makes about the summer of 2020, it perhaps will help the inquiry to understand what was driving government decision-making. In the summer of 2020, the government was absolutely focused on getting schools back on the 11th of August. That was our overwhelming interest. So, in terms of the point that Professor Woolhouse is making, there is a legitimacy in his argument where he might say, well, the government could have relaxed restrictions. I think Professor Woolhouse is making particular points about outdoor leisure activities.
His
perhaps.
position was that there should never have been any restriction.
Well, so I couldn't have gone along with that because I wanted to make sure that we could get the schools back on the 11th of August. That was a big issue for me. Now, if we had too much virus, too many cases, too much difficulty coming from the prevalence of the virus, the ability of the government to sustain the argument about a safe return to schooling on the 11th of August would have been challenged by that. So, in a sense, I'm partly agreeing with Professor Woolhouse that there's choices to be made in there. There are choices. And the government made its choices very clear about what we wanted to prioritise.
I think the part where you disagree, I think you'd agree that there were choices, but I think perhaps you're disagreeing on the proposition that I think he would make is that the wrong choices were made by the Scottish Government.
I do disagree with that, yes.
He is an expert epidemiologist.
I understand that, but the inquiry's also heard other evidence from other epidemiologists who take a very different view about the impact of the decisions that were made, particularly in relation to issues that matter to me around about school closures, for example.
He was the epidemiologist whom evidence shows was plugged into the Scottish Government decision-making framework from the 21st of January 2020, explaining to Catherine Calderwood, the then Chief Medical Officer, that what was going to happen was disastrous and measures needed to be taken, which ultimately were taken, but not at the time he was suggesting.
Listen, I have no interest in having a disagreement with Professor Woolhouse. I'm simply saying that in the particular scenario of the summer, there was a particular decision that I made a particular choice at that time, or I supported a particular choice being made, which I understand he doesn't agree with.
I think it's fair to say...
Mr Dawson,
sorry.
are we freezing the public gallery again? Could someone please check if something we can do to stop them developing icicles on their noses?
Thank you, Lady. What I was going to suggest was that, although you just don't wish to have a disagreement with Professor Woolhouse, I think it would be fair to say that Professor Woolhouse has a disagreement with you and the Scottish Government in that his view is that the strategy that was adopted was the incorrect strategy throughout, that it wasn't based on epidemiological evidence, which he was in a position to provide to the Scottish Government, and that resulted in a great deal of hardship, in particular with regards to harms 2 to 4.
And I think what I would say is that we faced in March 2020 and on various other occasions a very acute direct harm which was affecting and had the potential to affect a very substantial proportion of the population, and we had to act to suppress the effect of that harm. There were wider consequences, but what the Four Harms framework enabled us to do was to try to reconcile some of those difficult choices and chart a way out of the acute difficulties that we had faced.
Thank you, Mr Swinney. I'd like to turn now to the question of school closures that we discussed earlier. As well as being Deputy First Minister, you were until May 2021 the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills. Is that correct?
That's correct.
We've covered that already. Could we turn to INQ 000362664? Thank you very much. These are the minutes, again attended by you, of the Cabinet meeting held on Tuesday the 17th of March 2020. Page 5, paragraph 18, please. At subparagraph C, it says there, very active consideration was being given to the possible closure of schools and other educational establishments, but the evidence was not yet clear. The epidemiological evidence did not suggest that this measure would slow the transmission of Covid-19 down to a great extent and might in fact cause some additional infections, for example, by increasing children's exposure to grandparents over 70. And at page 9, paragraph 19D, it says the advantages, this is in the Cabinet agreement, the advantages and drawbacks of closing schools and other educational establishments should be considered further over coming days in light of emerging evidence across the UK. In your witness statement at paragraph 19 on page 9, you say, I felt the dialogue I had with Nicola Sturgeon about the closure of schools with effect from the 20th of March 2020 was a significant matter and was the product of informal communication. The circumstances were deteriorating quickly, school attendance was falling, staff anxieties were growing, and we needed to come to a definitive conclusion about whether schools should remain open. Nicola Sturgeon and I discussed the issue in person in the aftermath of the Cabinet of the 17th of March and again on the 18th of March. We took a decision that she should say on the 18th of March. The likelihood was that schools would close on Friday the 20th of March, and I confirmed this closure would take place in a statement to Parliament on the 19th of March. In light of the evidence that we've seen, that on the 17th of March, the Cabinet minutes record that the epidemiological evidence did not suggest that this measure would slow the transmission of Covid-19 to a great extent, and it might in fact cause some additional issues. What epidemiological evidence were you and Nicola Sturgeon given on the 17th or 18th of March that underpinned the decision, which I understand you both took, to close schools?
In the evening of the 17th of March, I was provided with further advice from my education officials about wider dialogue they were engaged with the United Kingdom government and the other devolved administrations about the issue of school closures and the possibility. And as part of that advice, they indicated to me that they thought it likely that SAGE on the 18th of March would conclude that the epidemiological case was in place for the closure of schools and that that would in fact bring an advantage. The other, so that was the difference. So when I received some information from my officials, I think on the 9th of March, which indicated to me that SAGE were not, largely replicating the point you made to Mr Dawson from the Cabinet minutes of yes. that the evidence didn't exist. That was largely the advisory position from SAGE in correspondence to me, I think, on the 9th of March. And then on the 17th of March, after the Cabinet meeting, I received this update which indicated that there was a growing assumption that SAGE on the 18th would provide the epidemiological advice that it would be advantageous to close schools. I was dealing with a deteriorating position, as my witness statement says. During the course of Tuesday, I was receiving data on school attendance, which was declining and had been declining. There was a decline in staff attendance, and when there's uncertainty in the number of staff attending and the ratio of pupils, that begins to make the opening of schools on a stable operational basis quite challenging. My officials were in discussion with directors of education around the country. Indeed, one director of education in Shetland had to move the school system in Shetland on the previous Friday to a hub model because of staff illness, and the school estate could not be run safely. So during the course of the 17th, I was becoming increasingly concerned that we were receiving data which was making the school estate unstable, and also epidemiological advice that indicated to us it would be advantageous to close schools. And on the 18th of March, the data was deteriorating further about school attendance, and I was concerned that we were in danger of operating an unsafe situation. And for that reason, the First Minister and I concluded in conversation that it would be appropriate for her to make that point clear on the 18th. I think also, for completeness, I discussed the issue with the Secretary of State for Education on the 17th, and we both shared our perspective about where things were heading at that time.
On what authority was the decision made?
On the 18th.
The decision to close schools, yes.
It was made as a consequence of direct discussion between the First Minister and I.
But not on the basis of a delegation of authority to make that decision if the situation changed from Cabinet?
That is fair, but my justification would be that events were moving at an absolutely ferocious pace, and I had to give clarity to the education system about what was likely to be pertaining in the days to come.
Was the advice from SAGE based on Scottish information and data?
I don't know the answer to that question.
The position that we understand at this stage is that effectively English data was used in order to try to work out the threat of the pandemic at that stage, and that obviously, as we know, subsequently Scotland developed its own data systems and advisory systems to try to address that. Yep. But at this stage, I think the position is that that would be based on English data.
I don't know that case, but obviously my officials were receiving advice from our clinical advisors, principally the Chief Medical Officer at that time, who took the view that was reflected in the advice that came to me, that there was that the appropriate step to take was to announce the closure of schools.
But you relied on the SAGE advice, I think you said.
I did, that's correct, yes.
And did you have the opportunity to interrogate SAGE about the application of that advice to Scotland?
I did not.
The position generally, epidemiologically, was that certainly London was considerably ahead of Scotland at that time in terms of the threat. Therefore, was it appropriate to base a decision on a conclusion reached by SAGE without interrogating it further?
I think it was, because I think it was pretty clear that what was happening in London was coming our way, and it would be coming our way pretty shortly thereafter.
What equality impact assessment was done on the likely effects on children's learning and development of the schools being closed?
At that moment, we did not have the time or the opportunity to carry out that assessment.
Does that mean none? None?
None, that's correct, yes.
What equality impact assessment was done on the state of preparedness to counteract those harms, including access to digital inclusion if schools were closed?
We did not carry out a formal assessment, but local authorities were encouraged to ensure that appropriate provision of education was put in place to support children and young people at that time.
Were any equality impact assessments done for children's mental health, those with disabilities or learning difficulties in particular?
Not at that moment, no.
What was the Scottish Government's exit strategy at this stage from this policy?
We wanted, and we made clear, that the resumption of full-time face-to-face education was of the highest priority for the Scottish Government, and essentially the development of the Four Harms framework was designed to provide us with the rational basis that would enable us to take decisions to restore full-time education at the earliest possible opportunity.
Thank you. A point that's been made to us by the Children and Young People's Commissioner for Scotland related to the fact that no education closure direction was made, which meant the necessity and proportionality of the decision to close schools was not scrutinised by Parliament. Is that factually correct? And why was no such assessment made? Sorry, no such direction made, I should say.
Yeah, the direction, like, it's one of these interesting points that at that moment we announced the closure of schools with the consent of local government. And I think that the statutory arrangements that are in place for a school closure are largely that a local authority has to close a school if there is an outbreak of a health nature driven by a direction from a Director of Public Health in an individual local authority area. So that's the formal position for the closure of one individual school. The situation we faced here was altogether different, and we did not have the statutory powers to enable that to happen. Those statutory powers essentially only came on a, on a Scotland-wide basis with the Coronavirus Act, which was yet to come into legislative force, yet to be passed by the Scottish Parliament, yet to come into legislative force. So we essentially made that announcement. It didn't have legislative underpinning. It was an expression of leadership in a desperate moment where parental anxiety was very high, staff anxiety was very high, and the concern for the well-being of children and young people was very high as well. And we took that decision to try to avoid some of the effects of coronavirus and its impact on the wider population.
Would it be reasonable to conclude, Mr Swinney, that at this time, and these are not my words, the Scottish Government was in a state of complete panic?
No. We were very anxious about the situation. We had a severe problem on our hands, but we were trying to take an orderly set of decisions that would provide clarity to those who required to have clarity from us.
Mr Swinney, did you ever consider an alternative to a complete closure of schools? For example, certain year groups or mornings or afternoons, anything of that kind?
Not at that moment, milady, because we felt that the severity of the situation that we were facing was of such a magnitude. Now, we did consider all of those questions at later stages for the return of pupils, which we envisaged potentially coming back on an approach which was called blended learning, which meant that some children would be in some days sometimes and not others, but eventually got to the point where we were able to return all pupils to full-time learning.
Thank you.
As regards you've mentioned already the consideration that went into the reopening of schools on the 11th of August. In that regard, what medical, epidemiological, scientific evidence were you aware of earlier in the year, in April or May, with regard to the extent that schools were contributing to the spread of the virus?
I think it was difficult for there to be a specific analysis given to that effect, although I do see in other evidence that the inquiry has indicated, has heard that there are studies which have indicated that school closures contributed beneficially to the reduction in the rate of fatalities as a consequence of COVID. But when we looked at the whole sequence of steps in relation to the reopening of schools, we did have the benefit of advice from a specific Scottish COVID education advisory group, who were a subgroup of the Chief Medical Advisors group which was convened by Professor Andrew Morris. The education group was was convened by Professor Carol Tannehill, the Chief Social Policy Advisor to the Scottish Government, and which included epidemiological advice and a variety of child psychology and educational advice that provided the underpinning for the reopening of schools in August.
So, presumably, that subcommittee, chaired by Professor Tannehill and others, child psychologists, etc., presumably the general tenor of their position would have been that it was important to do what we could in the balancing exercise to try to get children back to school, because it was almost self-evident that children not being in school would affect not only their learning, but their development and put them at social harm, etc., as we've seen in all the evidence. Was that broadly their position?
I never participated in their discussions. I thought it was important.
But you will have got something of their conclusion.
Well, I'll come to that. But I never participated in their discussions, so I never heard the exchanges that went on. But the advice that they were providing to me left me with the impression they were coming at this from the perspective of they saw and acknowledged the benefits of the return to schooling of children and young people, and they wanted to make sure that could happen at the earliest and safest available moment.
So from one might call that a harm-free perspective, it was a good thing to try and get children back to school as soon as one could, but that had to be balanced against harm one, which was the predominant consideration.
And that was my point about the summer of 2020 when we were having our exchanges about Professor Woolhouse, that I was desperate to make sure that we could get schools back in the 11th of August for all the legitimate reasons that you put to me.
What I'm interested in is why that didn't happen earlier, Mr. Swinney, because Professor Woolhouse in his evidence on the 24th of January told us it quickly became apparent through April and May 2020 that schools were contributing a little to the spread of the virus, but so little that there was essentially no danger that reopening schools would take us past the tipping point. He said, so closing schools, I accept potentially as a precautionary element of the first lockdown, because let's face it, we were practically panicking at that stage. It was necessary or justifiable, but we should have realised much, much more quickly, based on the evidence emerging from around the world, that this was not an essential element of our lockdown. So in my view, and we're going to this, I argued it repeatedly and frequently over that whole summer. Schools in Scotland could have reopened in May 2020, just as they did in Denmark. Why was it that you didn't take account of that advice, Mr. Swinney?
Well, some school pupils were back before the summer break, because we put a premium on young people who were making the transition from primary to secondary education, which is a challenging transition for many young people, was that they would be able to come back to experience some full-time, face-to-face learning in advance of the summer break. So we did actually, it's not just the case that pupils all came back on the 11th of August. We did take steps to get some pupils back before the summer break, recognising the beneficial element that could be.
With respect, Mr. Swinney, that's not an answer to my question. I asked you why it was you hadn't taken the epidemiological advice into account in considering sending all children.
Well, I didn't have that epidemiological advice from the advisory sources that were advising the Scottish Government. So I didn't have that from the group that was led by Professor Morris. I did not have that from the group led by Professor Tannehill. So I felt that I should follow and take account of the advice that I had in front of me that was offered to me from a wide range of disciplines.
Professor Woolhouse was a member of the group that was chaired by Professor Morris.
Well, I did not have advice in front of me which said I could safely bring back schools earlier.
Presumably, it must have been the position of the Professor Tannehill's group, if it existed at the time, that it would be a good idea from a harm-free perspective to get children back to school as early as possible.
Of course, yes, and that's the way they represented their advice to me. But it had to be done in a way that was compatible with the safety of everybody concerned, and also with the overall effort within the across the policy spectrum to suppress the prevalence of the virus.
Of course, so that harm-free consideration needs to be balanced against the harm-one consideration, yes?
Yes.
But what Professor Woolhouse is telling us is that from an epidemiological point of view, it would have been safe to do it earlier in the year.
Well, but I think that's not the advice that I had in front of me. And if I also come back to the point that I made earlier on, that there was a very different position about the number of people able to transmit the infection in the period to which you're referring, Mr Dawson, in early May, compared to in late June, when I took a decision that schools should return full-time in August.
Over the summer of 2020, the Scottish Government's focus was on attempting to achieve elimination of the virus, such that considerations of harm-free were put to one side.
No, because the Scottish Government's intent on suppressing the virus was designed to enable us to return people's lives to something resembling normality, and a key part of that was enabling children to return to school, which they successfully did on the 11th of August 2020.
I suspect, Mr Swinney, that those who take an interest in the business of this inquiry are more interested in effect than intent. Would you agree?
Well, that's what happened. The schools came back on the 11th of August.
As regards the closure of schools in the period we discussed earlier at the beginning of the second lockdown, we looked at the Cabinet conclusions INQ 000214456. We could look at that again, just to understand again what it was we were looking at. Paragraph 14. The final change which the First Minister planned to announce that afternoon was a requirement for all schools to continue to use remote learning except for vulnerable children and children of key workers until at the earliest 1st of February, instead of the current planned date of the 18th of January. This was necessary both because of the scale of community transmission of the new variant and because of the uncertainties currently surrounding the ease and extent of transmission of the new variant between symptomless young people. Mr Swinney noted that the current position was deeply serious and arguably presented a set of problems of greater magnitude than in the spring of 2020. One of the main challenges over the coming few months would be to get across to the public at large that despite almost 10 months of severe restrictions, now was not the time to relax observance despite the arrival of vaccines. Does that paragraph, I think, encapsulates the sentiment that you expressed earlier about the urgency of this particular situation and the evidence that you had. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
To what extent, once the lockdown was announced, did you take account of medical evidence about whether and the extent to which school closures were assisting in the lockdown and their contribution to the overall spread of the virus in January 2020?
That would have been part of the assessment about the prevalence of the virus, and then led into the consideration of what was the right moment at which we could begin to restore full-time learning for children and young people.
Yes, so because again, Professor Woolhouse told us that although it might have been legitimate to be cautious about the extent to which the alpha variant, which was had become the dominant variant at this stage, might behave differently from the previous variant with which we dealt in March. He said it very quickly became apparent in the second wave that schools did not need to remain closed and we could still control the virus, and yet they weren't fully reopened here until May 2021. This was unnecessary, though, well, forgive me, this is one of the aspects of the pandemic management that I really feel strongly. What we did to the children, and it would be bad enough if there was a detectable and measurable public health benefit to this, but there wasn't. This wasn't necessary, and we did it anyway. To what extent were you aware of that epidemiological information that suggested that the ongoing closure of schools was not conferring a public health benefit on the management of the pandemic?
Well, the issues in relation to the prevalence of the pandemic were at the very heart of decision-making on this question. So the whole assessment about what steps we could take to reopen schools was a product of what was the epidemiological assessment of the pandemic. So in terms of the analysis that would be constructed by all of those who were looking at these questions, looking at it through the four harms framework, recognising the premium the government attached to the return of full-time schooling, what would flow from that information was the decisions that we could take about the timing for the reopening of schools. And we started the reopening of schools, if my memory serves me right, Well, actually, in the second lockdown, the number of pupils who were being educated within schools was significantly greater than during the first lockdown by a factor of, I think, 3. So about 8% of pupils were being educated in school in the second lockdown because of the arrangements that we had for the hub provisions in schools. So schools across the country were open, and more schools were open in the second lockdown than the first lockdown. And then we essentially moved to a phased reopening of schools with some year groups coming in, if my memory serves me right, on the 15th of February, and then there was different stages thereafter. So the epidemiological information and the condition of the pandemic would be driving the decisions that I was able to take in relation to school reopening.
On the basis of your extensive involvement in pandemic recovery and indeed ongoing committees and things like that which relate to the recovery from the pandemic, is it possible even remotely to quantify now the extent to which the prolonged closures of schools have affected the development and learning of children in Scotland?
Well, we have undertaken in the course of we did undertake within the government in the course of the pandemic 13 children's rights and wellbeing assessments to consider these issues. We also, in the summer of 2020, undertook an equity audit which explored the impact of school closures and then led to the reconfiguration of the curriculum in the autumn of in August of 2020 to enable a much greater focus on supporting the well-being of children and young people who were returning to school after the first lockdown. In addition to that, I asked Her Majesty's...
Could I just pause you at that stage to ask about that? So in the summer of 2020, you had done an assessment, I think, you said, about the impact of the first lockdown as it was coming to an end on children. Did that tell you there had been a significant impact on children's learning and development?
It told us there had been an impact, a negative impact on children's learning and development. Yes, it did. And
so you knew that at the time you closed schools in the second lockdown. Yes.
Yes, but I did not feel I had an alternative because of the gravity that I expressed at paragraph 15 of the Cabinet Minute about the deeply serious situation that we faced, and I didn't, in all honesty, think that I could ignore the epidemiological advice that was being put in front of me at that particular moment. I think that would have been frankly reckless.
I understand that that's your position, Mr Swinney. As regards the assessment done of the further harms that would be caused by a second lockdown, was an assessment done of those harms at the time the second lockdown was imposed and schools were closed for a second prolonged period?
Well, at that moment, I asked Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Education to review the delivery of remote learning and to particularly explore issues around the health and well-being of pupils and of staff and of the availability of digital devices. The government put in place new resources which were designed to fill the gaps in relation to access to digital devices, and we of course had access to extensive amounts of online learning through the eSchool venture which the government had invested heavily in which the teaching population around the country significantly supported to make sure that in the second lockdown there was a much stronger platform for digital learning that was available to children and young people.
Thank you, Mr Swinney. I'd like to ask you about another element now of what I understand is your portfolio, namely the relationship and dealings with local government. We've already heard evidence about the fact that a levels system was introduced in Scotland in October 2020, is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
And if I get the nomenclature right, it was called a levels system. There was a similar system that existed in England, which was a tiers system, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And in the lead up to the levels system being introduced, there were some discussions, I think, of which we have evidence between, amongst others, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, about the UK government's plans and indeed the Scottish government's plans, which had given rise to documents which suggest, and also press reporting on the 12th of October 2020, that Scotland intended to implement and introduce a three-tier system similar to the one that England had, that the UK government had proposed. As at that point, was that correct?
I'm not sure that we'd actually had come to any formal conclusions on that. I'd have to check.
That is a matter of intention, I think. The intention was that that's what would happen.
I'm not sure we'd come to.
In the event, it didn't.
But we knew we were going to have a level system, because
Yes.
we knew we had to have some gradation of restrictions in different localities.
Indeed. As was the approach in the UK government at the time. Why was it that the Scottish government decided to have the 5-level system rather than the 3-tier system?
We judged that we needed to have a sufficient amount of variation between levels to take account of some really very different circumstances in Scotland. Geographically and in demographic terms, Scotland is a very diverse country. The circumstances that pertain in the Orkney Islands are very, very different to those that pertain in central Glasgow. And indeed, the circumstances that pertain in central Glasgow can be very different to those that pertain in rural Perthshire, where I have the privilege to represent. So we judged that we needed to have a range of circumstances that would reflect that diversity and enable us to exercise sufficient influence on or for any restrictions to be able to exercise sufficient influence.
And that wouldn't have been served, in your view, by the 3-tier system which you knew about that was going to be introduced?
I don't think the range would have been sufficient because of the point I've made about the span between Orkney and Glasgow, with Stirling and Perthshire in the middle.
Presumably there must be similar differences between central London and rural parts, say, of the north of England.
I'm not sure the acute differences of the island communities particularly pertain in England compared to the diversity of circumstance that pertains here. And we were anxious to make sure that we had a framework that would apply right across the country. Was
consideration given to the fact that, in particular, those who might spend time or live around the border, this would be incredibly confusing?
That was acknowledged, yes, and it was a source of some considerable attention during these periods, yes.
Mr Gove, in his evidence yesterday, said that the UK government's perception of the Scottish government's position was at times that it sought to create difference for no particular apparent benefit. Was this a situation in which Scotland wished to have a 5-level system just to be different from the English 3-tier system?
No, for the reasons that I've set out about the diversity of geography and demography in our country.
As far as the relationship with local government was concerned, you say in your statement that there was good and effective communication and partnership. Is that your position?
That is my position, yes.
You had some involvement in that aspect of the management of the pandemic, is that correct?
I had a lot of... I think my involvement with local government would fit into 3 categories. One, a strategic relationship with the political leadership of local government and the President and Vice President of the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, who I spoke to frequently and who I always made clear to I would listen to at any time. Secondly, I was the joint chair of the COVID Education Recovery Group with Councillor Stephen McCabe, who was the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities education spokesperson. And thirdly, I had quite a lot of dialogue with local authority leaders about the application of the levels.
Thank you. The inquiry is aware of a report by Professor Kevin Orr of the University of St Andrews, which is entitled Good Governance During Covid-19, Learning from the Experience of Scottish Local Authorities. Are you aware of this report?
I have seen that, yes.
Could we look at page 34 of the report, please? The report is one which provides findings and learning from discussions with senior officers and elected members in 6 Scottish local authorities. Is that correct? Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding.
And my understanding, certainly, I hope you agree with me, is that the 6 local authorities were chosen for this project to provide a mixture of different geographies, governance arrangements and political compositions. Is that right?
Yes.
as far as you understand it. Page 34, he notes that one chief executive was directly critical of what was felt to be an unnecessarily centralised approach by Scottish Government. It says the public face of the pandemic for both governments was their respective political leader. In Scotland, that was the First Minister. It was clear from a delivery partner perspective that the political involvement in all the decision-making associated with the response was all-pervading, and on some occasions the political optics seemed the guiding force. And of course, because of the 24/7 media world we now live in, the respective national political leaders were centre stage of that 24/7 media world. In the gold command structures put in place by Scottish Government, there was no scope for any departure from the nationally set approach, which was an unrelenting single focus on health harm rather than the four harms approach that was claimed. There was no real local decision-making and no real opportunity to influence the response actions to be taken. It was a here it is, and it's to be implemented. Since devolution in Scotland, there has been a growing tension between Scottish Government and local government, and the pandemic has exacerbated that tension, not only between respective politicians, but also across officials. Local political leaders were being held to account for decisions they had no locus in, and privately were being criticised by the government for not doing enough to support the response, when they were not being treated as a partner in the response. We have available to us in this inquiry a number of responses from a number of councils, including Aberdeenshire Council, North Lanarkshire Council, South Lanarkshire Council, West Dunbartonshire Council and Angus Council, the general tenor of which is that they felt they had no involvement in Scottish Government decisions which would affect their local authorities. Does this suggest, Mr Swinney, that your assertion that there was a good working relationship during the course of the pandemic with local authorities is misguided?
I don't think it does. I'm sorry that's how they feel, but let me just talk a little bit about the circumstances around the COVID Education Recovery Group. That was a gathering jointly chaired by myself and a representative of local government. The Auditor General of Scotland said in my report with the Accounts Commission, Improving Outcomes for the Young People Through School Education, we highlighted effective joint working by the Education Recovery Group during the pandemic. This strong foundation helped in the delivery of a rapid and nationally coordinated response to the pandemic in exceptionally challenging circumstances. So I'm disappointed that people don't share my view that there was a good partnership, but I put a lot of effort into chairing the COVID recovery group. I don't know how many times we met. Actually, it must be about, I don't know, probably about 50 or 60 times, with a group of people from national and local government, totally focused on the solutions, wrestling with the problems, working together. Not a very constructive atmosphere. So I'm really disappointed to see kind of text of this type, because it's not my feeling. President of COSLA, if I look back at my diary, I was speaking to the President of COSLA on the 3rd of March 2020 to make sure that COSLA were bound into the resilience arrangements for handling the pandemic, because I realised how significant they would be. And if I had, if I was involved in one conference call with local government leaders, I couldn't begin to count how many I was involved in. So I'm very disappointed to hear that conclusion. I think that's also that quote that you've read to me, Mr Dawson, I have to say sits quite at odds with the evidence that I think was led from the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities to the inquiry some time ago, which I think was of a very different character to that, which would largely have reflected my impression. But I valued what Scottish local government did. I saw it with, in my own community about how the local authority that in my area adapted to respond to the local circumstances. There would inevitably be tension about levels, because somebody had to take a decision about what was going to be the appropriate levels, and that fell to the Scottish Government. We were being scrutinised about it in the, as your commentator here says, in the 24/7 media world, and we did our best to engage with local authority leaders about the contents of that.
Is your assertion that the Scottish Government enjoyed a good constructive working relationship with local government during the pandemic mere rhetoric?
No, it's a statement of my honest view.
It is a common theme of the Scottish Government statements to this inquiry that in its dealings with the UK Government, the Scottish Government felt far from an active participant in decision-making. Is that broadly the tenor of some disappointment that the Scottish Government has expressed?
I think it's slightly more nuanced than that. I think there's some of that, yes, but there's also other evidence of good and constructive working.
Is the evidence that we have seen not indicative of the fact that the Scottish Government adopted that very same approach to local authorities?
I wouldn't say so, because we provided the opportunities for meaningful engagement and involvement by Scottish local government in the decision-making process in which we were involved.
Thank you, Mr Swinney. Those are my questions. There are some core participant questions, as I understand.
Thank you very much, Mr Dawson. Ms Mitchell. Mr Swinney, don't worry, you're not alone in this, but you're inclined to give very long answers.
Oh.
No, I mean, maybe it's a politician's thing, I don't know. Ms Mitchell has limited time, so to be fair to those whom she represents, Scottish bereaved, please could you try and focus on her questions?
I'm very much obliged.
My apologies.
Very much obliged, my lady. Mr Swinney, I appear as instructed by Amaranwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish Covid bereaved. In your written evidence to this inquiry, you say that you experienced no tangible presence of Alistair Jack, Secretary of State for Scotland, in any aspect of the work of handling the pandemic in Scotland. My question to you is, were there efforts made to engage him in this process? If so, what?
I think the short answer is probably no, because there was no real value in it. Because, as I explained in my witness statement, if the Scottish Government had a problem with the UK Government, the best way to solve it was to go directly to the person in the UK Government. And indeed, we had interlocutors who were quite helpful in trying to help resolve these issues. In my experience, the Secretary of State for Scotland would have contributed nothing of any useful value in assisting us in that process.
Well, the Secretary of State for Scotland indicated that he was concerned in relation to data not being available, Scottish data not being available, and that not being a satisfactory basis for decisions in Scotland, i.e. England-only data being used, and my learned friend touched on that with you earlier. Were you aware of his concerns in that regard?
I wasn't aware of his concerns, but what I do know is that significant efforts were put in place to ensure that good, accurate Scottish data was available at all times. Now, I don't know if it may be that the Secretary of State for Scotland is making that remark in relation to information that was available to the United Kingdom Government, but certainly in the Scottish Government, I felt we had very good Scottish data available to us at all times.
I think he was making it in relation to decisions that were being taken by the UK Government in relation to matters which also affected Scotland and that only had English data. You say that Scotland had Scottish data at all times, but it's clear from the evidence in the previous module and from this module that they didn't have access to Scottish data to assist them in that decision-making process.
But certainly I felt in Scotland we got data sets really very quickly in the pandemic that were developed and that we had available to us. I obviously am not intimate about what was going on in the United Kingdom Government and what information was available there. I think it's a very good example. If there was a problem with Scottish data being available for the United Kingdom Government, you know, that bluntly, that's an issue for the Secretary of State for Scotland to try to address, because that's supposed to be his job.
Do you not think that it's a loss of good use of someone who has that contact with the UK Government to use as a conduit for issues exactly on that basis?
In my experience of dealing with the current Secretary of State for Scotland, and I would not be saying this about his predecessor, is that the current Secretary of State for Scotland is not a help to get things resolved. His predecessor was. His predecessor, the Right Honourable David Mundell, was of enormous assistance in trying to get things sorted out. It's not been my experience of the current Secretary of State for Scotland.
But it's your evidence that you didn't try You didn't try and engage with them to assist?
Because of my experience before the pandemic.
Moving on to my next question, were you aware of, by the start of March, a growing concern that decisions on the pandemic response were being taken too slowly by the Prime Minister? What I'm trying to get is your sense of what was going on at that time.
I think there was during January and February, there was a growing alarm about the situation. And I'm talking about in Scotland. And there was growing preparations to deal with what we thought would be a very serious situation coming in our direction. As we got into March, during January and February, I think it was very difficult to be certain what was the right moment to absolutely escalate and operationalise those decisions. By the end of February, the beginning of March, it became apparent we were in that zone.
Well,
and the point, please forgive me, Ms Mitchell, and essentially there was growing frustration within the Scottish Government that we felt we needed to be doing more. We might not have the crystallisation of the caseload and the problem in Scotland, but it was growing, and therefore there was a frustration that things were not moving fast enough.
Well, speaking of frustration, were you aware of the views of Professor Sridhar and Mark Woodhouse at the speed of which actions should be being taken but weren't yet being taken by March?
I was aware of those views being expressed publicly, and indeed was paying particular attention to those views, and was considering, as the rest of the government were considering, what were the right steps and the moment to escalate, for all the reasons that we've talked about today, about the moments to capture public attention and public involvement.
Well, you speak of their comments publicly. If I may take you to the private conversations in relation to the CMO or Deputy CMO, were you aware as to their views on whether action should have been taken earlier by the Scottish Government?
I don't think it... I certainly felt I was being briefed by the Chief Medical Officer at the time of the growing severity of the issue, and we were wrestling collectively with what was the right moment at which to act. And we felt that it would be impossible for Scotland to move into a period of lockdown without doing that on a United Kingdom basis. We thought that would be incredibly difficult for us to put into effect, not just in legislative effect, but in terms of how that would have been perceived by people in Scotland and whether it would have secured compliance if the United Kingdom government was not doing the same thing.
And those were views being exhibited internally in the Scottish Government at that time, that they were considering lockdown? Well,
we were considering what was the, what are the stages of escalation we have got to go through? What are the things we have got to do? And as I've just rehearsed with Mr Dawson in detail the dilemma about school closures, in which the position changed dramatically. If we'd had a conversation on the morning of the 17th of March, I would have been saying, I'm not persuaded of the argument for school closures. By the morning of the 18th of March, I'd be having a very different conversation. And such was the pace at which events were changing in front of us.
If I may ask you about a specific issue, and that's in relation to mass gatherings. I know my learned friends already touched upon this with you as well. In your evidence to this inquiry, written evidence, you see the Scottish Government took the decision that all indoor and outdoor events of more than 500 people should be cancelled to protect emergency service capacity. I would like to know a bit more about why that decision was taken. Was in part that decision taken, or in part or in whole, by the fact that large venues and those in the entertainment industry, artists, etc., were starting to take the initiative themselves to, for example, cancel gigs or to close venues to protect the public, and it was only after this that the Scottish Government acted.
As I said to Mr Dawson, I wasn't intimately involved in that decision for the reasons that I set out. But I think, as with the situation in our schools, people were beginning to take their own course of action. And I certainly felt on the school issue that there was a danger of there being real uncertainty about whether schools were open or closed unless we gave some leadership to it. And that it may well have been the case that was part of the consideration in relation to the issue on the limit on 500 people. But as I say, I'm not in a strong position to give detail.
Have you heard evidence that it was said by those in the UK government that decision in relation to mass closures at the time was totemic? Were you aware of that? And if so, what do you think about that?
I haven't heard it being described as totemic. I don't quite understand why that would be the case. It doesn't sound like something I would describe as a totemic decision.
Moving on to question 4, I wish to ask you further about intergovernmental relations. In your written evidence, you say, at different stages in the pandemic, there would be issues of real concern about the conduct of the pandemic, and Scottish ministers would raise the concerns we held. Often the means of resolution involved escalating these issues to calls that would take place between the First Minister and the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Boris Johnson MP, or the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, the Right Honourable Michael Gove MP. This was not an efficient or effective way to manage the pandemic response. These meetings took the format of many of my experiences of dealing with the UK government, which was that the meetings were not meetings of equals or partners. I'd like to ask you a little more about this. Firstly, can you please give the inquiry examples about the issues of real concern which had to be escalated in the way you describe? What were these issues?
They would be issues perhaps about funding, which I know the inquiry heard with Kate Forbes earlier on today. There may also be issues in relation to the relaxation of restrictions. So there may be concerns about how that was proceeding and what the level of engagement and knowledge would be about that. The contrast of all of this is really with, I suppose, the decision in relation to taking of lockdown. That was a decision taken on a collaborative basis by the 4 governments of the United Kingdom.
Well, what I'm really more interested in is focusing on the what you raise in relation to the idea that this way of doing things wasn't a good way of resolving matters. And what you've said at, I think, a later stage in your statement is that there need to be urgent and wide-ranging reforms of intragovernmental structures. Given your position that this escalation to this small group of people wasn't a good idea, have you given consideration as to the mechanism that would be good in those circumstances?
I think a format which is collaborative in its nature, that treats different governments as having legitimate interests in arriving at a consensus decision-making approach would be an advantage. What happens, if I can explain, in my experience as Finance Minister, essentially we could have four nation discussions, but if we couldn't persuade the Treasury, then it was a lost cause. They had the veto. Now, in the fiscal framework in 2016, I secured in the Smith Commission a provision that the fiscal framework had to be agreed with the Scottish Government. That gave us equal status with the United Kingdom government in establishing a fiscal framework for the operation of Scotland's public finances. That's protected Scotland, and it only happened.
Could we avoid going into politics, Mr. Swinney?
I'm obliged, Lady. If I could just ask this final question, then, given that you've said about this collaborative approach, doesn't that point directly, squarely in the direction that the joint ministerial committee way of coming to decisions ought to have been used during the pandemic?
I think that would be greatly advantageous if it had operated in a fashion where governments were treated as equals. And the problem in a lot of the discussions that we had was that all governments were not treated as equals in the process.
And did the Scottish Government ask for those joint ministerial committee meetings?
We have worked assiduously, I say we, I'm no longer in the Scottish Government, but the Scottish Government has worked assiduously to try to improve intergovernmental frameworks for all the years I was a minister, because I've, I would be able to establish that my good experiences are in the minority of intergovernmental experiences.
Forgive me, but I asked the specific question with my lady's forbearance. Did the Scottish Government directly address the issue of the use of joint ministerial committees and ask that they be used in these sorts of circumstances to create the sort of or partnerships of equals that you suggest is the proper way forward?
I think that will have been the case. I'm pretty sure the former First Minister will have advanced that argument in her discussions, but I can't be definitive about that.
So you as Deputy First Minister aren't aware of that?
I can't be definitive about that, but I'm pretty sure it will be the case.
No further questions, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Mitchell. That completes the evidence for today. Thank you very much, Mr Swinney. I know I've now imposed upon you twice. I can't guarantee that we won't again, but I think it's unlikely looking at the nature of the future modules. It's just possible education, I suppose, when we come to that. Thank you very much for your help so far.
Thank you, lady. Thank you.
10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
Thank you, lady.